Greetings. Do without wilt should be the whole of the law. I'm Lexi Eve, and welcome back to another Magic in Theory and Practice video. Today we're going to be exploring Chapter 16, Part 2 of the Charge to the Spirit, with some account of constraints and curses occasionally necessary. Let's begin. Now, right off the bat, low magic is usually a mandatory field of magic in Thelemic grade work. In AA, Crowley mandates that the practicus in Netzach, 7 = 4, be able to evocate a spirit to physical manifestation. The least case of success being that the magician is able to see a mist within the triangle of art. This is a mandatory prerequisite to reaching Tifereth, 5 = 6, where the initiate will then focus solely upon knowledge and conversation with the Holy Guardian Angel. This tells us that evocation is important to that milestone. But why? Well, I believe that getting in direct contact with one's HGA requires building the same part of one's spiritual apparatus that allows them to see low spirits. And low spirits also correspond with unconscious parts of the self, many of them toxic parts of self. So one needs to have these aspects of their psyche in check and mastered before attempting to approach their angel and calling themselves an adept. Even in the Abramelin operation, just before one ends the whole endeavor by summoning their HGA, they spend several days evoking the 4 demonic kings. Having just spent months invoking higher forces, one then goes to the lower forces, reaching up and then down, becoming a whole and complete being, at which point they are in the very center of the tree of life and meet their HGA. There's a definite sense of balance going on here. In the Goetia, Crowley made a drawing of himself evoking Paimon, as you can see on your screen now. Above the image of him in the spirit is drawn his Golden Dawn motto, Perturabo, but next to that motto it says, 6th degree = 5 square. Now this is very unusual, as that is not his 6 = 5 motto. I inquired online about this illustration because I cannot recall Crowley ever writing about whether he truly evoked Paimon, so I wanted to know the intent behind that. So for this video, I was wondering if I could explain the when and why of this evocation, as it might yield a good example of how to properly summon a spirit in Thelemic grade work. I did receive a solid reply, and so I intend to quote my friend in full, and it's with their permission. According to Robert Flores, quote, Crowley never specifically mentions this invocation, though there are a few mentions here and there that imply he did indeed invoke Paimon, this drawing being one of those. No exact date can be established as when this may have occurred, as the copy of the Goetia, which included the drawing in question, includes notes by Aleister Crowley added years after he initially utilized it. However, I would guess that he did indeed do this invocation, and it was likely during the initial Abramelin working in January or February 1900. The strongest evidence for this is the grade and motto given in the drawing, both of which signify Golden Dawn and likely nothing to do with knowledge and conversation or AA directly." End quote. So while the purpose of summoning this spirit is not explicitly known, we can guess that Crowley was still in the Golden Dawn at the time. In my opinion, was probably a Zealot Adeptus Minor, performing the Abramelin working, and was plotting on how to attain grades higher than what Mathers had to bestow. Now I say all of that to say, there are ways which can be healthy to work with low spirits, and infinitely more ways that are unhealthy. I suggest staying away from such practices, as in the Goetia, until you are ready to use such things as means to attain spiritually. I strongly recommend not using the likes of low spirits to get your petty wants fulfilled. To do so is going to feed your ego and potentially bring you ruin. That said, we're going to dive into the chapter of Magic in Theory and Practice and discuss in depth how to safely call up low spirits, then how to charge them. You must be in command of both it and yourself, so let's look into the chapter. Quote, on the appearance of the spirit, or the manifestation of the force in the talisman which is being consecrated, it is necessary to bind it by an oath or charge. A spirit should be made to lay its hand visibly upon the weapon by whose might it has been evoked, and to swear obedience and faith to him that liveth in triumph, that reigneth above him in his palaces, as the balance of righteousness and truth, by the names used in the evocation. End quote. I've seen people approach low spirits the same way they would approach an invoked deity. This is horrible, as most low spirits look to twist your words and intentions, sometimes spitefully to hurt you, sometimes just because they are unstable or chaotic forces. Either way, they end up running rampant and destroying the magician. When you make a spirit appear in the triangle, it is best to force it to swear obedience with words of promise chosen very carefully, so that it promises to obey you completely and not cause any mischief. Also worth mentioning here is the dismissal of the spirit. One commands the spirit in the license to depart to leave, quote, without causing harm or danger unto man or beast, end quote. And the last line states, I charge thee to withdraw peaceably and quietly, and the peace of God be ever continued between thee and me. Amen. End quote. These words are not just a nice sentiment. They command the spirit to do no harm soever. Quote, it is then only necessary to formulate the oath or charge in language harmonious with the previously announced purpose of the operation. End quote. By using a sword, the magician keeps the spirits separated from themselves as blades divide, whereas the wand brings together. Note that in the charge, you command the spirit to take a vow. You read it, and it repeats such things, for example, as, quote, to be obedient to the instructions and thoughts of yourself, that it will be ever the willing servant of thee, a spirit of truth, that in departing it will do no harm to thee or anyone, and in particular, that this temple you're in shall not suffer through this ceremony, but shall be purified and fortified thereby, that it will be at peace with thee, and seek never to injure thee, but to defend thee against all thine enemies, and to work eternally for thine welfare. End quote. Now, to quote the chapter of Magic and Theory and Practice again, quote, the precaution indicated is not to let oneself sink into one's humanity, while the weapon is extended beyond the circle. Were the force to flow from it to you, instead of from you to it, it would be infallibly blasted, or at least become the slave of the spirit, end quote. What that's saying is, you're in your circle, the spirit's in the triangle, you just put the sword outside of the circle without your physical body leaving the circle. The sword will be just inside the triangle, you're holding it, and you extend light and the force of divinity from yourself through the weapon, and the spirit places its hand on that weapon that's outside the circle in the triangle, takes its vow, and then you bring the sword back into the circle, and you make sure that in no way that spirit has any access to you physically, that it is not pushing its force into you, otherwise you're going to find yourself in a world of hurt. Now, this requires knowledge of how to properly utilize the astral light and manipulate energy. If you cannot push light from yourself through a magical weapon, you're probably not capable of doing this with a sword and your spirit. You then run the severe risk of being overwhelmed. Besides that, I want to share a cautionary tale about using the Goetia in general, as I genuinely just like sharing stories and experience. I think it's helpful. I once spoke with a former friend who summoned a spirit to help them find their credit card. They promised the spirit they would spread word of the spirit and how it helped them. I looked at him dumbfounded because up until then I had respect for them as a magician. This promise they made was loose, and besides that, the operation they did was sloppy, utilized no magical weapon or circle save for an LBRP for their safety. And basically I saw calamity on the horizon. I asked him, well, how much do you have to spread this word about this particular spirit? You seem to never have stipulated how much you would do this. So he told me that the next day he did find his credit card in a jacket which he had been wearing every single day, yet suddenly the card appeared in it. So, is that enough to just for him to tell me about this experience and the particular spirit and its name and whatnot? Or does he need to tell 100 people? Does he need to rent a billboard about this spirit and how great it is? In my opinion, spirits like this are never satisfied, and it now owns him for as long as it wants. He's basically the spirit's plaything. And sure enough, in the next few weeks, I saw his attitude and his personality warped. He became increasingly aggressive. He started fights with random people or people close to him otherwise. He lost his job and was even kicked out of our lodge, all because of his mental state. So that's my cautionary tale from secondhand experience. To move on with the chapter quote, At no moment is it more important that the divine force should not only fill, but radiate from the aura of the magician." End quote. Before calling the spirit, invocations, circle castings, purifications and consecrations of self, your space, and all magical apparatus must be performed. By having divine authority of the spark of creation within us, and glowing in our body of light, we are capable of commanding low spirits. Then we need to consider very deeply why we are calling them, and finally consider, well, what we're going to say to them. Choose your words carefully. We now move on to the second and third sections of this chapter. Quote, "Occasionally, it may happen that the spirit is recalcitrant and refuses to appear. Let the magician consider the cause of such disobedience." End quote. Sometimes a spirit of a certain station high enough demands one be facing a certain direction, or a certain gesture be performed, or a specific offering be provided, else they will not manifest. Crowley suggests checking the astrological time, because maybe it is the wrong planetary hour for that operation. Quote, "The obstinacy of a spirit usually implies a defect in invocation. The spirit cannot resist even for a moment the constraint of his intelligence, when that intelligence is working in accordance with the will of the angel, archangel, and God above him. It is therefore better to repeat the invocations than to proceed at once to curses." End quote. Let's say we were working with the spirit of Mars. You could invoke Madim, Elohim Gibor, the angel and archangel, and you may even invoke the intelligence of Mars, utilizing the sigil of Graphiel. I suppose Mars deities could be invoked. In that sense, you could probably even do the invocation of Horus, if in a certain context Horus has a good connection with Mars as Avenger, you know? Swords, fire and blood, swords and spears, so there's a Mars connection there. But usually divine names and intelligence, in my opinion, just feel cleaner in this regard. You will note that in the Goetia there are several charges of the spirit, each more intense than the previous. So if the first charge yields no result, the more forceful second charge has more power to bring the spirit forward. Quote, "The magician should also consider whether the evocation be in truth a necessary part of the karma of the universe, as he has stated in his own oath. For if this be a delusion, success is impossible. It will then be best to go back to the beginning and recapitulate with greater intensity and power of analysis the oath and the invocations, and this may be done thrice." End quote. Of course, also quote, "Of course this should have been done in preparing the ritual, but he renews this consideration from the new standpoint attained by the invocation." End quote. If something is not aligned with your will and you have no pre-existing karma to work out, no ritual will make something happen, period. Quote, "But if this be satisfactorily accomplished and the spirit be yet disobedient, the implication is that some hostile force is at work to hinder the operation. It will then become advisable to discover the nature of that force and to attack and destroy it. This makes the ceremony more useful than ever to the magician, who may thereby be led to unveil a black magical gang whose existence he had not hitherto suspected. His need to check the vampiring of a lady in Paris by a sorceress once led Frater Perdurabo to the discovery of a very powerful body of black magicians, whom he was obliged to war for nearly 10 years before their ruin was complete and irredeemable as it now is." End quote. Though I will add, I all too often see people online immediately assume, even in their mundane life, that when something goes wrong, it can't possibly be their fault, let alone have they the wherewithal to check their karma before immediately blaming someone who they dislike or they feel dislikes them, and probably never even thinks twice about the fact they exist. All I'm saying is be careful of delusions and assumptions that someone is cursing you. While sure it can happen, usually people thinking someone attacking them, they're not even important enough for someone to take that time out of their day to go about doing that. So such thinking can tend to be ego aggrandizement and potentially more dangerous than any curse or low spirit evocation. But if you've checked your work and still the spirit does not come, keep in mind that, quote, "Some demons are of a nature such that they only understand curses and are not amenable to courteous command, end quote. It may just be that you have not mustered enough power or authority to command the spirits manifest. In such a case, going back to basics will probably be your best bet. Build up a magical current and go through your work again until such a time as you have the power and authority needed. And if still you do not get the desired result, quote, finally, as a last resort, one may burn the sigil of the spirit in a black box with stinking substances, all having been properly prepared before him, and the magical links properly made, so that he is really tortured by the operation, end quote. Quote again, this is a rare event, however. Only once in the whole of his magical career was Frater Perdurabo driven to so harsh a measure, end quote. I'm curious what event Crowley is referring to. If you happen to know, please leave a comment. Section 4 of the chapter. In short, Crowley warns against the spirit being too willing to comply. It may be that it has some trick, or that it knows something in your protection setup is weak, or even that what you command it to do may be twisted to some evil end easily. I cannot stress enough that the wording of how you talk to a spirit must be considered to each and every word, each and every thought. How many mythologies about genies warn of how a genie grants some wish only for the person to beg them to undo it with their second wish because their words were twisted? Section 5, quote, the charge to the spirit is usually embodied in some kind of talisman. In a certain sense, the talisman is the charge expressed in hieroglyphics. Yet, every object soever is a talisman, for the definition of a talisman is something upon which an act of will, that is magic, has been performed in order to fit it for a purpose. Repeated acts of will in respect of any object consecrated without further ado. One knows what miracle can be done with one's favorite mashie, which is a golf club. One has used the mashie again and again, one's love for it growing in proportion to one's success with it, and that success again made more certain and complete by the effect of this love under will, which one bestows upon it by using it, end quote. The sigil of the spirit on a particular type of paper or leather can be the talisman referred to here. Or consider the reason you call the spirit and find a suitable item to symbolize the magic you wish to do. To give an example of talisman but not low spirits, I have one thing in my experience that's suitable for this. So for money spells, which I caution against when working with low spirits, but just to give an example, for money spells, you might use a special coin. Or one ritual I did used a dollar bill folded into an origami inverse triangle like a cup, the symbol for water, the upside down triangle, and then I consecrated it with certain sexual fluids in the sigil of Jupiter. That talisman worked very well for money, which was needed for procurement of certain magical apparatus at the time. Quote, it is of course very important to keep such an object away from the contact of the profane. It is instinctive not to let any other person use one's fishing rod or one's gun. It is not that they could do any harm in a material sense. It is the feeling that one's use of these things has consecrated them to oneself, end quote. You never want anyone to touch anything you've consecrated or will consecrate. Touching things puts your energy into and karmically links you to them. If someone touches your talisman, sure, you can purify and reconsecrate it, but it can never be untouched. Every time you use that item, an unconscious association with the person who handled it will lurk in the depths of your mind. Now, I'm skipping past some misogynistic sentiments in this chapter. I was going to explain how a certain order with a certain sex degree probably put these ideas into Crowley's mind, and hence in this system only the male seed is useful, which is why he makes these misogynistic statements, but I decided not to tarnish my channel by commenting directly. They will remain nameless, and I will just say that Crowley as a man was sometimes a piece of shit, but for all his misgivings and failings as a person, he did a lot of work which is changing society today. I could ignore some poor behavior in exchange for the practice and synthesis of magical traditions which he laid out. After all, no Thelemite should be following anyone, even Crowley, directly in their own footpaths. You should be trudging your own way and being yourself. We can use his work, but must lead ourselves and become our most authentic self. Don't be a dick just because the prophet sometimes was one. The chapter closes with more about talismans, but I intend to make a video about talismans in the future, so I will not go into these final paragraphs, and I'm just going to end right here. Love is the law, love under will. I'll see y'all in the next one.